the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. Presidential candidates on Israel and Palestine. One of Israel's most famous directors talks about his new film, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now on this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. It's that time of the election cycle when every candidate shares ideas about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And no surprise here, they're confident they can solve it and do so quickly. In the case of Republican primary contender Donald Trump, it's not only the candidate himself who's bragging. Surprisingly enough, it's Democrat former Senator and current Secretary of State John Kerry. When Kerry was running for president in 2004, according to a biography of Trump that's sold in the lobby of Trump Tower, Kerry said, quote, "You know how to negotiate. You'd be the best person to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict." According to BuzzFeed's report, quote, Trump, volunteering his services, said, "It would take me 2 weeks to get an agreement." On the Democratic side, Hillary Clinton, appearing in a CNN town hall discussion, emphasized her relationship with Israel as a key element of her foreign policy expertise. She emphasized her statecraft during the build-up to an Iran deal.
You cannot imagine how tense it was because a lot of our friends and partners in the region basically just wanted to end that program by bombing them. Just bomb them, send them back a couple of years, just stop it. I spent a lot of my time explaining to our friends why that was not a good idea.
Clinton then spoke of how she pursued a scaling down of Israel's invasion of Gaza in 2012.
But I flew from Cambodia, where I was with the president, to Israel, middle of the night, go see the Israeli cabinet, work with them on what they would accept as an offer, go see the Palestinian president, work with him to make sure he'd back it up, go back to Jerusalem, finalize the deal, fly to Cairo, meet with President Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, hammer out the agreement, announce it at about an hour before the deadline that we were facing. They got a ceasefire. There was no invasion. That's what you have to do.
By contrast, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, who is Jewish and has had a strong showing in polls for the Democratic nomination recently, has been noticeably quiet on Israel issues throughout his campaign. But going from the diversity of opinions about Israel to the diversity of opinions in Israel, a group of some of the largest Jewish federations in America is funding a push for diverse approaches to marriage in Israel. Ann Arbor, Boston, Cincinnati, Greensboro, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, St. Louis, and Washington, D.C. federations are all funding the initiative, as well as some private foundations. It's called the Israel Religious Expression Platform, or IREP, and it's announced grants for each of a Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox groups, as well as a fourth group, Chidush, to advocate within Israel to increase marriage options in the Jewish state. Currently, civil marriages and non-Orthodox Jewish weddings may not be legally performed in Israel. Moving on, famed Israeli filmmaker Amos Gitai is tackling one of the darkest moments in Israeli history in his latest film. Rebecca Honig-Friedman has that story.
More than 20 years after the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a new film opening in the U.S. takes a deep look into the circumstances surrounding his death and their implications for Israel today. TJC sat down with the director, acclaimed Israeli filmmaker Amos Gitai, on his recent trip to New York.
It's the forces of cynicism and evil, combination of cynicism and evil, which assassinated Rabin.
A prolific filmmaker, Gitai is most well known for films like Kadosh, Kippur, and Free Zone, starring Natalie Portman, films that tackle often controversial Israeli religious and political subjects. And his latest is no exception. A scripted feature with some documentary elements, Rabin, The Last Day is not a biopic about the fallen prime minister, but an autopsy of the events surrounding Rabin's assassination. And it depicts an extremist religious and political culture that, the film suggests, led to the murder. Gitai makes no bones about his political agenda.
This film I did not just as a filmmaker, but as an Israeli citizen who is concerned about the direction that the country is taking now.
Incorporating real archival footage, much of Rabin, The Last Day, is comprised of scripted reenactments of interviews and hearings from the Shamgar Commission, which was assigned to investigate the procedural and security failings that allowed for Rabin's assassin, Yigal Amir, to get close enough to shoot Rabin at the end of a peace rally on November 4th, 1995. For the film, Gitai gained access to previously classified transcripts from those hearings, and the film depicts allegations from those hearings against extremist rabbis from the settlements, who allegedly invoked Talmudic arguments to call for the need to get rid of Rabin, whom they considered traitorous for his willingness to give up land for peace.
I was not aware of the level of violence which Rabin was confronted the incitation against him, calling him part of the satanic groups, the big public demonstrations.
As the film explores, Rabin's assassination came at a moment in Israel when peace with the Palestinians seemed possible, after Rabin signed the historic Oslo Accords in 1994, sharing his iconic handshake with then leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. It was Rabin's efforts toward peace that inspired Gitai, who was living in France in the early 90s, to return to Israel.
So it was a kind of a great moment of optimism. And I felt that this is a time that I would like to come back and do work in Israel.
But the move toward peace, and especially the proposition of giving up land, was deeply unpopular among many on the religious and political right. The film includes archival footage of protests against Rabin, including of current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking against Rabin. Indeed, Gitai's film depicts Netanyahu as one of the villains of the story, and Gitai is not shy about expressing his dislike for the current prime minister.
What Netanyahu is doing is sending the Jews against the Arabs, the religious against the non-religious.
The more obvious villain, Rabin's assassin, Yigal Amir, is played by the actor Yogev Yefet, who approached the role with some trepidation, Gitai recalled.
He said, Amos, in order to portray this role in a convincing way, I have to identify with the killer, which I don't like. So I told him, you have to do what you have to do. You are an actor. You perform it, and so it was not easy for him. But I think he did a great job.
But if Rabin had lived, would there have been peace with the Palestinians? Gitai cites an interview in the film with former Israeli Prime Minister and President Shimon Peres, who was Rabin's foreign minister.
We asked him, if Rabin was alive, do you think we would have been more close to a peace, maybe not a complete peace, but and he said 3 times yes, and Peres knows more than me.
Rabin, The Last Days, opens in New York on January 29th. For the Jewish Channel, I'm Rebecca Honig-Friedman.
Thank you, Rebecca. Finally, this week on Up Close, there are times when those in charge of a country act with seemingly complete disregard for the law. We saw that in the United States with former President Richard Nixon. To a differing extent and in a different way, the Soviet Union saw it with Joseph Stalin. But how did that culture of illegality develop, and how did those around them react? The culture of law-breaking and secrecy in Richard Nixon's administration is examined by USA Today Washington Enterprise editor Ray Locker in Nixon's Gamble, How a President's Own Secret Government Destroyed His Administration. And then, telling stories about one of the most damaging governments in the 20th century is University of Sydney professor Sheila Fitzpatrick, author of On Stalin's Team, The Years of Living Dangerously in Soviet Politics. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Sheila Fitzpatrick. What you're digging into here, the people around Stalin, and you find a culture there that still is very submissive to him. But there is more of a sense of partnership or teamwork there than you might expect.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm not trying to say Stalin is not the top man, the in effect a personal dictator. But what I'm trying to point out is that he's got this group around him. They're his political associates. They are serious players in the political and governmental game. They're not just courtiers. And they're also his social circle. And last thing, they stay around with him, most of them, for 25 years, which is a terrible long time in politics.
One could posit a whole range of reasons why any given dictator lasts for a short period, lasts for a long period. So Stalin probably survives for any number of reasons for multiple decades. But these guys played a big role in that.
They're important support. And, the question of why he wants them around is kind of interesting. I think it's in a communist system back then, you couldn't just say, I'm going to be a personal dictator. Lenin had not said that about himself, who was Stalin's predecessor. He was the head of the Politburo. In other words, a team. There was Lenin's team too. So that's what Stalin sees as the sort of legitimate thing. But it's not only for legitimating purposes within a communist context. It's also, I think, because he likes to talk stuff out. He doesn't always come into a meeting with a team and say, okay, guys, this is how we're going to do it. More often he says, we've got to think about this problem. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And he sits there. And then at the end he says, okay, well, looks like we go this way. Now that may or may not be the sense of the meeting. He doesn't have to go with the meeting, but that's the way he likes to play it.
But one of the things that naturally comes to mind with Stalin is that classic term that Hannah Arendt framed, the banality of evil.
Mm-hmm.
And you bring it up in regards to Stalin, and because he doesn't seem, he's certainly not this philosopher type. You know, he's just kind of, he's a guy, he can make things happen. But then at the same time, he's smart enough to be extremely manipulative. You know, you said, I think at one point, that you would sometimes shake your head when reading his correspondence and say, "You cutting bastard."
Yeah. Well, you know, he's smart. He actually is smart. So that I wouldn't want to suggest with the use of that banality of evil phrase that that means he's necessarily a stupid person. He is smart, and he's the smartest of the bunch of them. And as for in terms of intellectual, you know, he is self-educated, but he works on it. Actually, he's pretty well read. But I think any time you look at the banality of evil, perhaps applies better not so much to Stalin, who's, you know, he's initiating stuff, but to the team members who
or just bureaucrats, just
well,
or in some
not
cases,
quite as far
right.
as that. But in any case, they are often implementers of a policy that they've signed up for, but they haven't initiated.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable. Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.